So LS has been released from Cloud9, and while I don't want to do anything about speculation, I would actually like to address how he approached the draft and kind of maybe get into the genius of exactly how LS maybe had operated. Now, initially, when I look at all of his drafts, what immediately comes out to me is the idea of comfort versus ideal composition. So, this is something I think that is probably the biggest criticism or the biggest favor within LS. It's depending upon how you approach the idea of the ideal comp versus something like comfort. And it's the idea that there is some way in which both of those accesses cross to where it's actually more ideal to go for, the comfort composition rather than the composition that is more adherent to the meta, or it's more adherent to the actual picks that you should pick, right? So that also includes niche picks and whatnot, or picks that counter other different champions, etc. And I think with just the 4 games that we have seen from LS's drafts, I think we can easily say that he is more in the camp of the ideal draft, the draft in which makes the most sense based upon the champions rather than the actual players themselves, or maybe what they would consider comfort, right? So that along goes with the idea of practicing a champion takes a long time to learn. And I think he has kind of maybe debunked this idea, at least in the short term, right? We only have 4 games to go off of. But in the short term, I think he has pointed towards the idea that that is actually a myth. That as long as you're in, top form as far as a pro player is concerned, then you should be able to almost pilot any champion as long as you know a lot of the skills, you've been playing the game for a decent amount of time, and you just know the general fundamentals, I guess, about multiple different roles and maybe the flex picks, etc. And this is kind of a little bit of a stretch too, because you're just like, oh, well, Soraka mid, that's not a flex pick. Like, not in any region that I know. But, I mean, with his knowledge of, what he said when he had played it in Korea in mid lane and whatnot, he was just like, this is not a bad idea. But it's the point of that he had such little time for Fudge to even work with that. It was revealed that they had actually practiced it in the practice room of the LCS. Playing it, and this is like, an hour before their match? And they decided to play it if the opportunity presented itself, which it did. So I think we can clearly say that it's very, I guess, up in the air in terms of whether it actually does in fact take a long time for someone to master a champion, especially considering if a champion is as simple as Soraka. And that's not to say that Soraka is necessarily simple in the laning phase in mid lane, but she's certainly more simple as the game, goes later on. Now, the other point, and this also ties into the Soraka pick, is that it seemed like LS used a lot of flex picks and counter picks. So I'm going to bring up a couple games here. And so we're just going to go through that. We're not going to analyze it all crazy like and shit. I'm just going to go for some overarching themes. And I probably couldn't even break down all the nuances and shit to you guys anyways. But I did notice some outset things. So let's go for this first one, right? With the Soraka that I was talking about. Notice how the last pick is Camille in the top lane. And in the Cloud9 video, they were talking about Soraka mid lane, and then obviously how Summit could then overtake top lane because now he has a Soraka heal on his team. So he could 1v1 anyone at any time, basically. So he always has the push. He always has the threat to kill. And so that naturally gives Summit the way to win the game. And not only that, but he ends up getting like this last power pick and whatnot. And we all know that Camille scales up to a ridiculous degree. And there are very few champions that can actually beat her when it comes to the late game, let alone when you have a fucking Soraka on your team that could just ult you. So this is like where you can see exactly where LS's mind is, in the fact that he gives a lot of priority maybe towards Summit. Now you look at another game here. This is against Golden Guardians. This was their first game, actually. He ends up giving Summit last pick with Gnar, right? Because he sees Renekton there as, the last pick from Golden Guardians. So he says, okay, fuck it. Gnar beats Renekton, so I'm just going to pick that and completely smash you. And not only that, but I'm going to have an Ivern too, so that our team fight is just way better than your guys's to begin with, and that Gnar is inherently a better team fighter than Renekton anyway. So I just basically just destroyed you with 2 picks alone. And then, it ended up that Blabber actually popped off with Gwen, in the jungle and whatnot. And that was obviously a flex pick type thing of just like, okay, well, either Blabber can play it or Summit can play it. So, you decide who you want to get fucked by. So the next draft is that you could see Aurelia was picked, which is obviously a flex pick. And I think Team Liquid know this at the end of the day, because it's just like, well, yeah, Fudge obviously knows how to play Aurelia and also does Summit, but then they save the last pick for Summit and they go with him on Aatrox, which I assume is probably a pretty good matchup into Gragas. So now you have another instance to where LS is favoring his top laner and his solo lane in order to get ahead. Maybe also too because that allows the entire Cloud9 to have like mid and top pressure to actually, do invades or do whatever the fuck that Blabber wants to do, in fact. Then you have, of course, LS's final draft, which has the Malphite come out. And once again, this is red side, where he gets the counter pick for top lane. He says, okay, well, since you picked Jace, I'm just going to neutralize that, in fact, and I'm not even going to care about the split push at the end of the day, and instead, I'm going to have a go button that you cannot ignore, because Malphite go button is just so difficult to ignore, especially when he has flash. It's almost just a guaranteed knockup, at that point. So he basically just checkmates the enemy team once again at this point. So I think, and then on top of that, 10 minutes in, Summit is ahead in CS on Malphite, and then he goes Warden's Mail, which I think even Freak pointed out on the cast, I want to say, to where Warden's Mail is actually good to do instead of Thorn Mail, or the Brambles Vest or whatever, the baby Thorn Mail, right? Because it blocks more damage. So at the end of the day, I think LS had a lot of faith in Summit and, for him to be last pick. And I think you could say that most of these drafts did rely on last pick and on red side as well, being for the top lane. And I think that maybe alludes to part of, LS's philosophy as far as the draft is concerned. But additionally, maybe we could consider, draft is OP at this point. Because when you look at the advantages that Cloud9 had actually gained from just the draft itself, I think it's almost undeniable at this point that if you are very intelligent about the draft, you can gain your team a substantial lead before the game even starts. And this is something that I think it's difficult to test, scientifically, because now we don't have LS in the league, and, him to further, I guess, go on his experiment. But it seems as though not drafting for comfort and then not drafting specifically towards the meta, but in fact drafting based upon the situational awareness of said enemy comp is the best way to go if you're able to do that. And if you're able to do that, then you have a crazy advantage that almost guarantees you winning the game, basically. So, to address what else LS did, which was he did internal scrims, maybe this is where a lot of this information came from, and some of the testing and whatnot. And certainly maybe it was like a hyperbolic time chamber, because Cloud9 looked really good out the gate, just immediately. And no one was really expecting this. You could look at all the power rankings and whatnot, and that Cloud9 were going to take some time to ramp up, because they have a foreign roster, a mixed roster. You also have LS coming in and getting his bearings and whatnot. So I don't think anyone had this team, I would say like top 2. I think that would be quite absurd, but they were playing like a top 2 team, I would say. So with that, I think maybe you could assume that the internal scrims actually had a significant effect. And then on top of that, having buy-in from the organization themselves is, I think, a feat in and of itself. Now, that might not be true, right? Given that LS was recently released and we don't know the reason for it, but we're going to assume without any judgment, right? So at the end of the day, I think LS has put his money where his mouth is. And I find that incredibly respectable. Someone that put his reputation on the line to go for exactly what he believes in, his philosophy about the game, and his way, in order to train players and to instill his own meta and believe in his own meta and his own ideas and the fundamentals about how he thinks about the game. I think that's incredibly impressive, because he's always criticized other people about those said topics. And I think the evidence at least points more towards that he's correct in his thought process and how he views the game. And, he was willing to even showcase Soraka mid to Fudge, a couple hours before they actually had to play their match. And that willingness to put his reputation on the line, even towards his own players, I think speaks volumes about Ellis's ideas and character, about how he approaches the game. And, for all of what it's worth, I think that's incredibly courageous of him to do. And I think as far as him and I guess his ideas about draft and his ideas about team compositions, I think the evidence heavily favors him, as far as like his ideology and his way of approaching the game itself.